Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010, Summer 2019 session. Our book is Introduction to World Philosophy, and in this video we're going over question number 2 for part A for exam 4, which says, combine Plato's concept of the three parts of the soul in the Republic to his chariot analogy in the Phaedrus, and the Hindu concept of the Three Gunas as described by Ishvarakrishna and Patanjali. Okay, so this is the three parts of the soul in the Republic we saw previously in the Phaedrus. And the Phaedrus is Socrates describing life between incarnations. After your soul leaves one physical body at death, and before it takes another, it travels out to the outermost heaven of the universe, where it can see the absolute ideas, the absolute idea of beauty and justice and all of the absolute ideas. And then it can come back after 10,000 years, and he's got all kinds of stipulations about what bodies you get in the next life. But the analogy he uses, which is very similar to the Katha Upanishad, is that the soul has three parts. It's a charioteer, which is the intelligence or reason, and then it has two horses with wings. And one of the horses is bodily appetites, and the other horse is kind of chivalrous passion. And the chivalrous passion horse obeys the charioteer of reason, but the horse that's filled with bodily appetites, or that represents that aspect of the soul, doesn't listen to reason and tends to pull the entire soul down towards bodily desires on earth instead of out towards the horizon of the cosmos, where it can perceive all of the absolute ideas that reason feasts upon. So, and then the three gunas are the three modes of material nature, the three strands that they talk about in Ishvarakrishna's verses on the analysis of nature. So that's Samkhya philosophy, and the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. So the yoga philosophy, it has in common the three modes of material nature. Everything is made of a combination of three modes of nature. And they are sattva guna. So guna means strand, or like a string. So there's sattva guna, the mode of goodness, raja guna, the mode of passion, and raja also means king, and tamaguna, the mode of ignorance. And that's similar. The parallel for the Phaedrus analogy would be that the sattva guna is the charioteer, and the winged horse that obeys the charioteer is Rajaguna, the mode of passion, and then Tamaguna would be the bodily appetites, the horse that strives downward. So that's a very brief overview, but we haven't gone over the part of the Republic yet where Socrates is talking about the three parts of the soul. And another thing to keep in mind is, does the soul really have three parts? We saw in the Phaedo, which was the dialogue about Socrates on the day that he was given hemlock to drink. So he's on the day of his death, he was giving proofs for why he's not afraid of death. And one of them is that the soul is non-composite. It's not made up of parts. It was never assembled. It's eternally a simple thing with no parts. And that's more likely to be eternal. If it hasn't been assembled, it cannot be disassembled. So to say that the soul has three parts goes away from that claim in the Phaedo. And also, according to the Samkhya philosophy and just Hindu philosophy in general, the three modes are not your soul. They are the all-pervasive organizing principles of the material cosmos, which includes a subtle, unmanifest nature. And that is what Plato calls, or has Socrates call, or it's the philosopher named Timaeus, that Plato wrote a dialogue called the Timaeus. In that dialogue, Timaeus talks about a mortal soul, so that there's your soul proper, and then encompassing that as a subtle material body or a mortal soul, and then covering that as the gross material body, and that the mortal soul carries you from one gross physical body to another, but that anything material is made of combinations of the three modes of nature, the three gunas, sattva guna, raja guna, tama guna, goodness, passion, and ignorance, or reason and passion and appetites, to use Plato's terms. So that in the Phaedrus, that the three parts of the soul analogy, if you were to translate that into the Hindu philosophy, that's your subtle material body, carrying the soul out to the outermost horizon. If you haven't lost all attachment to material desire, then your subtle material body takes you back down, and you have to choose another gross physical body. When I say gross, I don't mean disgusting, I mean just tangible, visible, whereas the subtle material body is not visible. It's only visible through its effects. Okay, so in the Republic, on page 84, Socrates, he is talking to Glaucon and Adimantus, and honestly, I don't know exactly which one of the two brothers he's speaking to right now. I should have looked it up, but at any rate, for our purposes, he's saying, well, I'll just start here and then I'll explain what he's saying. We won't, I said, be overly positive just yet, but if on trial this conception of justice can be verified in the individual as well as in the state, there will be no longer any room for doubt. If it is not verified, we must start a fresh inquiry. First, let's complete the old investigation which we began, you remember, under the impression that if we could first examine justice on a larger scale, it would be easier to recognize justice in an individual. So that's the whole foundation of the Republic, Plato's famous Republic. They're looking for justice. The question that they're all discussing is, what is justice? And so Socrates proposes a solution. He says, well, let's look for justice in the ideally just state, on the assumption that the state is just a magnified version of the individual soul. And if we can find justice in the good state, then we can identify justice in the individual soul. So he's trying to amplify, magnify the image of the soul to the level of the state. And then they develop the ideally just state in their minds, in their imagination, just for the purpose of locating it in the soul. So it's this utopian state, and it takes a lot of crazy turns, and there's a lot of debate over how serious Plato was, or was he joking. At any rate, on the surface value, they create this ideally just state, and it turns out it has three classes, three castes. There's the caste of the philosopher kings, and then beneath them is the auxiliaries, and then beneath them is the merchant class and the laborers and everybody else. And those three classes that they established in the state, justice is when those three classes each do their own work properly. The philosophers guide everybody, and they live a life of extreme ascetic renunciation, and they fight, but most of the fighting is done by the auxiliaries, who are like the warrior class, and they carry out the instructions of the philosopher class, and then the rest of the people engage in growing the food and being merchants and the regular business of society. So those three classes are similar to the three parts of the soul that we saw in the Phaedrus, and that now Socrates here in the Republic is going to say there must be, if the soul is reflected in the state, those three classes of the state must be reflected in the soul. So there is the love of knowledge or reason, there is the passionate or spirited side, and then there's the love of money or the love of material bodily goods. And that's what he'll go on to say. Although it is, he gives these kinds of warnings as at the beginnings of his big grand schemes that this might be all wrong, and if so, we'll have to start again. If you look on page 84, the right-hand column, he says, very true, I said, and I don't think that the method we're employing is at all adequate to the accurate solution of this question, whether the soul is many or one. The true method is another and a longer one. Still, we may arrive at a solution not below the level of the previous inquiry, so they go on ahead. So he frankly confesses we're not using the appropriate method to discover whether or not the soul is one or three or what's going on, but anyway, let's just continue. Okay, so on the left-hand column on page 85, he's saying, all right, we see these different states. Some of them have more passion, like the northern states who like to fight. Then he says, some of them love knowledge, like us here in Athens. Some of them love money, like the Phoenicians and the Egyptians. Yeah, okay. And don't you think those states get those qualities because those qualities are inherent in the individuals who occupy those states? It just transfers up from the individual to the state. He goes, yes, that must be the case. So then he goes on to say, but the question isn't quite so easy when we proceed to ask whether these principles are three or one, whether that is to say we learn with one part of our nature, are angry with another, and with a third part, desire the satisfaction of our natural appetites, or whether the whole soul comes into play in each sort of action. To determine that is the difficulty. Yes, he said, there lies the difficulty. Then let us now try to determine whether they are the same or different. How can we, he asked. I replied as follows. The same thing clearly can't act or be acted upon in the same part or in relation to the same thing at the same time in contrary ways. So he's going to go on to make that the same thing can't be different from itself at the same time. So the fact is, you do have these three parts of the soul. Okay, again, in the Phaedo, he says, no, the soul is definitely not made of parts. It's just one whole soul. These three parts of the soul more likely correlate to the mortal soul that Plato wrote about in the Timaeus. I'll actually, just for the time being, let me just read from the Timaeus, section 69c. He says, and they, so he's talking about offspring of the demigods who help create the universe, imitating him, received from him the immortal principle of the soul, and around this they proceeded to fashion a mortal body and made it to be the vehicle of the soul, and constructed within the body a soul of another nature which was mortal, subject to terrible and irresistible affections. So the mortal soul is the mind, the subtle material body that the Hindus talk about, and that is what is influenced by the three modes of nature. The gunas, the sattva guna, raja guna, tama guna, or what Plato calls the love of learning, the spiritedness or passion, it's the chivalrous part or chivalrous mode of nature, and then the bodily appetites. That would be the tamaguna, the mode of ignorance. Okay, so he's saying, well, nevertheless, he's saying the soul must have three parts, he's saying here in the Republic, although he warned, I don't think we're doing this the right way. So he said, haven't you ever noticed that some people are thirsty, but then they refuse to drink? Yeah, I've noticed that. You know, if you're out in war and you're very thirsty and you're battling, you don't want to say, okay, time out, I got to go get a sip of water. You just say no to the part of you that's thirsting. So there's two parts, one part versus another. So he says, all right, there's two parts. One part that has desires and then another part that regulates the desire. So he says that must be reason. Yeah, that's rational. The reason says, it's not time to drink, just control yourself. But then he introduces a third. So this is on page 87. He says, well, actually, the bottom of the left-hand column of 87, he says, then we may fairly assume that there are two, that's parts of the soul, and that they differ from one another. The one with which a man reasons, we may call the rational principle of the soul. The other, with which he loves and hungers and thirsts and feels the flutterings of any other desire, may be termed the irrational or appetitive. The ally of sundry pleasures and satisfactions? Yes, he said, we may fairly assume that to be different, them to be different. Then let's finally determine that there are two principles existing in the soul. And what of passion or spirit? Is it a third or akin to one of the preceding? And then, so now they're going to say, all right, there's actually three parts. And here's the story, he says. Well, I said there's a story I remember in which I put faith. The story is that Leontius, the son of Aglaon, coming up one day from the Piraeus, under the north wall on the outside, observed some dead bodies lying on the ground at the place of execution. He felt the desire to see them and also a dread and abhorrence of them. For a time he struggled and covered his eyes, but at length the desire got the better of him. Forcing them open, he ran up to the dead bodies, saying, "Look, you wretches, take your fill of the fair sight." And he says, "I've heard the story myself. The moral of the tale is that anger at times goes to war with desire, as though they were two distinct things." And then he says, okay, I'm going to continue to read this next paragraph. "And aren't there many other cases in which we observe that when a man's desires violently prevail over his reason, he reviles himself and is angry at the violence within him? In this struggle, which is like the struggle of factions in a state, his spirit is on the side of his reason. But for the passionate or spirited element to take the side of desires when reason decides that she shouldn't be opposed is a sort of thing which I believe you never observed occurring in yourself, nor, I should imagine, in anyone else." All right, so there's three parts of the soul, which is more likely the mortal soul, and that is reason, passion, and then desire or appetites. And reason, he'll go on to say, in the state, the reason is like the shepherd, and the passion is like the sheepdogs. And then the rest of the people are like sheep, and that the dogs obey the voice of the shepherd. And if someone tries to attack the sheep, or if the sheep start acting unruly, the dogs will discipline them. So he's saying, okay, so, and that passionate side, it boils and chafes and is always on the side of justice. If the soul has committed a wrong deed, and then the person that you stole from or did something bad to inflicts pain on you, then your passion will not be stirred for revenge, because you say, it's just, I deserve it. But if someone attacks you and you don't deserve it, then the passionate side will never stop until justice is served. So it loves justice, but justice is perceived by reason. So the reason, and then I'll see here on page 88, in the left-hand column, "The illustration is perfect," he replied, "and in our state, as we were saying, the auxiliaries were to be dogs and to hear the voice of the rulers who are their shepherds." Okay, so that is the view of the three parts of the soul in the Republic. So now we're supposed to combine that with the three parts of the soul described in the Phaedrus, and then the Gunas. So I will now turn over to page 256. So here's the Phaedrus, and actually page 257 in the left-hand column in the middle of the page. He says, "Of the nature of the soul, though her true form is ever a theme of large and more than mortal discourse, let me speak briefly and in a figure, and let the figure be composite, a pair of winged horses and a charioteer. Now the winged horses and the charioteers of the gods are noble and they work well, but with people there's a problem. With mortals there's a problem." But let me just continue to read here the next paragraph. "I'll endeavor to explain to you how the mortal differs from the immortal creature. The soul in her totality has the care of inanimate being everywhere, and traverses the whole heaven, appearing in diverse forms. When perfect and fully winged, she soars upward and orders the whole world. The imperfect soul, losing her wings and drooping in her flight, at last settles on the solid ground." All right, so the soul in her totality traverses the whole heaven and has care for all inanimate being. We'll see all of the absolute ideas are in this outermost sphere that the soul travels to in between incarnations, where the absolute idea of justice is, the absolute idea of beauty, and any other absolute form. So we saw in the Republic, in the cave allegory, the entire three-dimensional material world unfolding over time is like a shadow of the absolute ideas, or the eternal forms. Those eternal forms we learn in the Phaedrus are specifically out at the outermost horizon of the cosmos, where souls go between incarnations. At the end of the Republic, there's the myth of the near-death experience of a soldier named He also went out to the outermost horizon of the cosmos, where he's witnessed other souls choosing their next life, and then each soul came back to Earth, tethered to the horizon of the cosmos by a thread of destiny. So I've said in previous videos, the reason I like to focus on this is not only that it's such a crucial part of understanding ancient Greek and ancient Indian philosophy, but also that academic cosmology seems to have come full circle back to this original idea in the form of holographic string theory, which I've talked about. In the 20th century, physics evolved away from Newton's physics, which is very powerful at predicting things in a certain scale, but if you get too big or too small, it doesn't work anymore. You had special relativity, general relativity, quantum mechanics, and string theory, all in the 20th century. String theory combines relativity theory and quantum mechanics, the theory of the big and the theory of the very small. And what it says, in a nutshell, is that the past, the present, and the future of the universe are interwoven at the outermost sphere, where space-time is expanding away from Earth at the speed of light, from our perspective on Earth, and that it radiates back in to create the three-dimensional illusion unfolding over time, this holographic illusion, which is being projected from this outermost horizon, which is what Plato is saying. Everything comes from these absolute ideas. They're located at the outermost horizon. The soul in her totality merges with that horizon and never has to return, he says in the Phaedo, but in the Phaedrus, there's no choice to stay there forever. And that probably has something to do with him in the Phaedrus identifying the soul with what is most likely the subtle material body, or the mortal soul, that has these three influences of reason and passion and desire. So it's not just an exercise in understanding the history of an era. Oh, look how ridiculous they were back in those days. They thought everything existed at the outermost sphere of the universe, and then that projected this illusory world. Oh, that's ridiculous. Well, that's where we're back to if you listen to holographic string theory. And so this might help us understand this newest cosmology better if we go back to this older form of it, this kind of prototype. All right, so if you look on the right-hand column of page 257, he's saying, but when they go to banquet and festival, this is the demigods, then they move up the steep to the top of the vault of heaven. The chariots of the gods in even poise, obeying the rein, glide rapidly. But for everyone else, there's labor, because the one horse that wants all the bodily appetites is constantly pulling the chariot down, away from the outermost heaven. For the immortals, when they are at the end of their course, go forth and stand upon the outside of heaven. The revolution of the spheres carries them round, and they behold the things beyond. He says, there abides the very being with which true knowledge is concerned, the colorless, formless, intangible essence, visible only to mind, the pilot of the soul. That's what the divine intelligence feeds on. He'll go on to say that she is replenished and made glad until the revolution of the worlds brings her round again to the same place. In the revolution she beholds justice and temperance and knowledge absolute, not in the form of generation or of relation, which men call existence, but knowledge absolute in existence absolute. Beholding the other true existences in like manner and feasting upon them, she passes down into the interior of the heavens and returns home. Okay, so that is what happens. Now I'm going to describe a little bit more about these two horses and the charioteer. On page 259, actually at the bottom of page 258, the right-hand column, he says that, and at the end of the first 1,000 years, okay, I'm going to skip this other one, but the soul which has never seen the truth will not pass into the human form, for a man must have intelligence of universals and be able to proceed from the many particulars of sense to one conception of reason. Those are the absolute ideas. Reason says, oh, look at all these trees. What makes them a tree? Oh, the idea of tree, the perfect essence of tree. And where is that? At the outermost heaven. This is the recollection of those things which our soul once saw while following God. When, regardless of what we now call being, she raised her head up towards the true being, and therefore the mind of the philosopher alone has wings, this is just, for he is always, according to the measure of his abilities, clinging in recollection to those things in which God abides. In beholding them, he is what he is, and he who employs aright these memories is ever being initiated into perfect mysteries, and alone becomes truly perfect. But as he forgets earthly interests and is wrapped in the divine, the vulgar deem him mad and rebuke him. They do not see that he is inspired. All right, so the absolute ideas in God's mind are out at the outermost horizon of the cosmos. What did Plato mean by the word God? Different people have different opinions. Some say it was an impersonal ordering principle of the universe. Some others say, no, he had the idea of a personal God interested in our being, because God supposedly sent Socrates to Athens with a mission to get people to care for their souls and not for their bodies. At any rate, that's where the absolute ideas are. We'll see St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas followed that idea to develop Catholic theology. And so keeping that in mind, he goes on now to explain the three parts of the soul better. So, as I said at the beginning of this tale, I divided each soul into three: 2 horses and a charioteer. One of the horses was good and the other bad. So, the good horse, he says, is a lover of honor and modesty and temperance and the follower of true glory. He needs no touch of the whip, but is guided by word and admonition only. The other is a crooked, lumbering animal, put together any which way. He has a short, thick neck. He is flat-faced and of a dark color with gray eyes and blood-red complexion, the mate of insolence and pride, shag-eared and deaf, hardly yielding to whip and spur. So the one horse is well-formed and is a lover of glory, and all that horse needs is the word of the charioteer, and then that horse obeys. The other one, when Socrates says he's short, thick-necked and has a flat face, he's making fun of himself, because he had a notoriously flat face and bug eyes like a stingray. He would make fun of himself, although he was also considered a great soldier on the battlefield. But the point here is, you got reason as the charioteer, passion is the good horse, and the appetitive part of the soul is the shameful horse. And the ending example is that the shameful horse sees a lover and wants to do sinful acts with the lover. And then the rational part of the charioteer and the good horse say, no, we're not going over there. But eventually they give in to the desires of the shameless horse. So they at first indignantly oppose him and will not be urged on to do terrible and unlawful deeds. But at last, when he persists in plaguing them, they yield and agree to do as he bids them. So usually the appetitive part of the soul overrules reason and passion, and people end up doing base, sensual things. All right, so there is the Phaedrus. And now on to Ishvarakrishna from verses on the analysis of nature and the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. So page 218 on the left-hand column, section 2. So the revealed or scriptural means of removing the torments are like the perceptible, i.e. ultimately ineffective, for they are connected with impurity, destruction, and excess. A superior method, different from both, is the discriminative knowledge of the manifest, the unmanifest, and the knowing one, or knower, i.e. Purusha. So there's the manifest and the unmanifest. That's the gross and subtle material nature. And the Purusha is the soul, which is separate from matter. So he'll go on to say that I'm looking for the part about the 3 gunas, the right-hand column, section 11. Both the manifest and unmanifest are characterized by the three gunas, constituents or strands: undiscriminated, objective, general, non-conscious, productive. The Purusha is the opposite of them, although similar. The gunas, whose nature are pleasure, pain, and indifference, serve to manifest, activate, and limit. They successively dominate, support, activate, and interact with one another. Sattva is buoyant and shining. Rajas is stimulating and moving. Tamas is heavy and enveloping. They function for the sake of the Purusha like a lamp. So, Sattva guna, Raja guna, Tama guna. Sattva is buoyant and shining. That's reason, if you're going to compare it with Plato. Raja, which means king, that's the mode of passion, which loves glory, chivalry. Tamas is ignorance. It wants bodily pleasure, intoxication, and sleep. And it's the heavy one that weighs things down. Sattva's buoyant, Raja's heavy. Tamas is heavy, and Rajas tries to get the heavy part to go up toward the buoyant understanding of reason. So continuing here in the left-hand column, the plurality of Purushas, so there's many individual souls, is established because of the diversity of births, deaths, and faculties, because of actions or functions that take place at different times, and because of the differences in the proportions of the three gunas in different entities. So everything is made of the three gunas, everything material, manifest and unmanifest, the gross matter and the subtle mortal soul of the mind. Everything from a rock to your mind is made of these three strands of being, of material being. And they act like a lamp for the soul because they enable you to see the material world. But the entire material world is like a dream of the higher spiritual world, to which you try to return by shedding the three modes of nature. So, and the three modes of nature as a whole, they're called prakriti, or nature, versus purusha, or the soul. So section 20, because of the proximity or association of the two, i.e. prakriti and purusha, the unconscious one, that's prakriti, appears as if characterized by consciousness, which is purusha. Similarly, the indifferent one appears as if characterized by activity because of the activities of the three gunas. So the three gunas are acting. When you act, your soul's not really acting. It's the three gunas that are acting, and you're just along for the ride. The soul is encompassed by the subtle material, unmanifest mortal soul, or subtle material body, the mind. And that's manipulated by the three modes, constructed of the three modes. And your gross body is also constructed of the three modes. For example, they say foods. Every food is a proportion of the three modes of nature. And some are predominantly in the mode of goodness or passion or ignorance. Food in the mode of goodness would be like fruits, fresh fruits and vegetables. In the mode of passion would be rawish type meat, like a tiger might like, or even some vegetables like garlic, kind of an aphrodisiac. And then in the mode of ignorance would be old, rotten food. Some people like to age food, fermented foods, and like mushrooms even, because they grow out of decomposing matter. So these three modes are in the mind, and that's what determines the caste system. So it's not supposed to be, oh, my parents were this caste, therefore I'm in this caste. It's supposed to be, you become the caste that you are qualified to be, and that's determined by the modes of nature. Which one of the modes are you predominated by? If predominantly in the mode of goodness, then you're a Brahmin. If predominantly in the mode of passion, then you're a Kshatriya, which is the warrior political caste, which is why Raja Guna means king. If you're predominantly in the mode of ignorance, Tamas, then you'll be in the laborer class. If you're a mixed mode of Rajas and Tamas, then you're in the merchant class. So the Hindus have 4 castes, whereas Plato combined them into 3. But his third class, the merchant trader class, includes the laborers for Plato. So, I will. All right, so that is the ending of Ishvarakrishna's verses on the analysis of nature, page 219. section 23, says, the buddhi, which means will or intellect, is characterized by ascertainment or determination. Virtue, knowledge, non-attachment, and possession of power are its sattvika form. Its tamasa form is the opposite of these. So vice, ignorance, attachment, and impotence. That's tamaguna and sattvaguna. So raja's intermediate. And according to Plato, the mode of goodness or reason controls the mode of passion, or rajaguna, and then rajaguna tries to control the mode of ignorance, tamaguna, the bodily appetites. Although more often than not, it seems the bodily appetites end up controlling the other two. Okay, so now the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. He says on page 220, section 116, superior to that is the absolute disinterestedness or lack of desire for manifest or unmanifest phenomena, guna, qualities, because of perception of the purusha, true person. So the best kind of a person is unattached to the manifest physical objects as well as mental states of mind. The soul, purusha, is detached, and the goal is to achieve a state of aloneness, separateness from matter, kaivala. That's the ultimate good that they're striving for. But we're just focusing on the three modes of nature. So if you move over to page 221, section 2.18, he says, what is to be seen, i.e. nature, is characterized by the three qualities or strands of A, intelligence, B, activity, and C, stability or inertia. Sattva, rajas, and tamas. It includes the gross elements and the sense organs and has as its meaning enjoyment for or liberation of the conscious being. All right, enjoyment for or liberation of the soul. That's the same image in the Phaedrus. The charioteer with the two horses can either pull the soul up to the outermost horizon where it can perceive the absolute ideas, or it can pull the soul down to the earth where its wings fall off and it feasts on the pasture of bodily appetites. So that's a good comparison, section 2.18 and the Phaedrus. Okay, so I'm going to read here section 2.25. When spiritual ignorance is no longer, the conjunction is no longer of soul and the three modes. This is the relinquishment, the aloneness, kaivalya, the highest good of the seer, the conscious being. So over on page 222, section 3.49, the yogin, whose awareness is restricted to perception of the difference between the strand of nature called intelligence, sattva, and the conscious being, achieves mastery over all states of inner being and knowledge of it all as well. Okay, so you have to distinguish your mind from the three modes of material nature. Your soul must be distinguished from the three modes, which include the subtle body of the mind. Sattva guna is the guna closest to the soul. So the last detachment, you have to be detached from the material mode of goodness in order to achieve the spiritual mode of pure goodness, kaivalya. So continuing here on the left-hand column, section 3.54, the cognition born of discrimination carries to the further shore with everything as its object, in every fashion, and non-sequentially. So that is the further shore is the ether, the akasha, the outermost horizon. So the Hindus and Plato both say that's where absolute knowledge is to be had. Of every object, in every fashion, and non-sequentially. So every object that ever existed in the universe, from the past, the present, and the future, is interwoven at that outermost ether sphere, the akasha. And everything inside the volume of the universe is made of the three modes of material nature. So you're trying to disentangle yourself from these three modes. So continuing, section 355, when the intelligence strand, i.e. sattva, and the conscious being are equal in purity, aloneness, kaivalya, ensues. So the final transformation at the further shore, where everything is experienced simultaneously, is when the material mode of goodness is transformed into the pure form of spiritual knowledge. When they're of equal purity, then you've reached this aloneness. Karma is neither good nor bad. That belongs to the yogin. For others, it is of three types: good, bad, or a mix. Skipping to section 413, particulars are manifest or subtle. They are of the nature of combinations of the strands of the three gunas, so manifest and subtle, gross matter, subtle matter. The truth or particularity of a thing is due to a unique transformation of nature, a unique combination of gunas. So everything is made of these three modes of material nature. And over on page 223, he says, section 431, then, since awareness is unlimited when parted from coverings and impurities, what remains to be known is trivial. Thence, the completion of processes of transformation on the part of the strands, gunas, their purpose fulfilled. I'll skip to section 434. Aloneness, kavalya, the highest good, entails the reversal of the course of the strands or qualities of nature, gunas, now empty of meaning and value for the conscious being, or it may be understood as the power of consciousness returned and established in its own true self. When you reach the furthest shore, the outermost horizon of the universe, your soul merges back with the absolute ideas of God's mind. That's what Plato says in the Phaedrus, and that's also what is indicated here in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. So I think we've gone over all the bases for the discussion question, which I'll read again now. So part A, this is for exam 4, question number 2. Combine Plato's concept of the three parts of the soul in the Republic, so that's chapter 3.2, to his chariot analogy in the Phaedrus, and the Hindu concept of the three gunas as described by Ishvarakrishna and Patanjali.